Welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now. All right. Welcome to the Stoa. And this was supposed to be posted a couple of days ago, but admin stuff, I just slipped through the cracks. And I kind of like it this way because, this is probably going to be a messy experiment. And so the idea here is Jason, Jared, and myself, when we last talked about memetic mediation, we had this notion of having this campfire, right? This digital campfire, and people gather around and kind of talk shop, mediation shop, about what people would be good to have around the campfire together, what kind of like memetic opponents to have, and just have a heart-to-heart conversation about what they believe to be true. And so what we thought, kind of our rough workshop for today was that Jason, Jared, and myself will maybe just talk for like 5-10 minutes about what we're doing here, and then we'll open it up to group discussion. So that being said, I will unmute Jason and Jared, and we can begin.
Nice.
Thanks. Thank you, Peter. Maybe just a brief intro. The idea of memetic mediation was coined actually by Peter and in his article with Connor Barnes. And since then, a bunch of folks have been kind of, thinking about that term, trying to think how it can be applied, writing about it. There's like a letter wiki between me and Peter, but there's also more of an open source document. And the idea is basically, it's nothing really new, but it's just, it seems to be that, especially online, there's a lot of warring subgroups of people that might have more in common than they think. And especially in these days when we need, in my view, a more decentralized, distributed, networked alternative to the establishment, which in certain institutions that seem not to be working, we need to be able to talk to each other and make sense with each other, even if we don't like each other. So I thought I'd just give that little intro, and that's kind of what brought us here, is something that we've been writing about and thinking about for a while, but it's an open source concept.
Yeah, and I think in our last conversation, for those who didn't hear, we were exploring a bit of the boundaries between kind of deliberate and structured mediation versus implicit kind of emergent mediation. And I think both of these approaches, it's kind of the bottom up, top down approach to this need to be considered for sure. And yeah, this is, maybe this is a way of building some structure, a bit of a place for us to start collaborating and see what emerges. So yeah, thanks Peter for creating the structure and the forum for this for this emergent exploration to come up.
Yeah, my pleasure. So the question I have for you two guys, so maybe we can jam for a couple of minutes. What's coming to mind is this tweet I did recently about because right now I don't really give a shit about the medium of broadcast, of content broadcast, like, my podcast or the YouTube channel I just threw up. And I thought of there's like a conflation sometimes between the spirit of a community that arises in these domains versus the actual broadcast output of it, the medium for that. And I'm like, so if you kind of focus more on the latter, the medium for content broadcasting, that's going to create memetic tribes. But if you focus on this digital campfire and build real communities around it, there's a potential to create embodied tribes. So that's coming to mind right now. I just maybe wanted to see if anything landed there for you guys.
Yeah, so maybe flesh out a little bit what we talked about with this idea. From what I remember, is that I know a few people have been kind of thinking along these lines of having, say, a YouTube channel that is kind of a, it might be managed by somebody, but you can have any kind of set of people, it could be a pair or 3 people who can record something and put it on this channel that, is basically with a theme of, trying to have a sincere and constructive conversation. And so, it might be people who would, have been beefing on Twitter or, and some other platform. And, they weren't really having a constructive dialogue with each other. It was getting contentious. This would be an opportunity to be like, kind of like with Letter Wiki, it's like, hey, why don't you folks write a letter to each other? Well, it's kind of like the analog of that, but on something like YouTube or some other video platform, where you could be like, hey, let's get on and have a recorded video. And I guess it doesn't have to be recorded, and so this channel would just be, you would see this, you could go to this channel and you'd be like, whoever's part of this network and who wants to, so maybe you would sign up like Letter Wiki, whoever wants to sign up and be, start a conversation, they can do that and put it up to the channel. Is that kind of what you had in mind, Peter?
For this digital campfire thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, something like that. It's, I guess to the even more central, it's just a space for people to kind of spitball and workshop about what would be, how to memetic mediate in this line of liminal war that we're in, or culture war that we're in. And because when I talked to you yesterday, you mentioned, a certain spat or beef that is happening, and I wasn't aware of it. Or you talked about, and you also talked about Richard and Jack Murphy.
Yeah.
And I didn't know that they had a spat. I'm like, oh, that's that was just like, you nailed that match right there. And I don't know if it's going to happen, but that's a perfect match. And I was ignorant of that kind of spat. But if we have more people gather around the digital campfire that resonate with memetic mediation, then we can kind of source out those potential matches and then brainstorm ways to figure out how to make it happen. So I think that is the essence. Yeah.
And one thing I would like to emphasize, and maybe you might disagree, but it doesn't even have to be on the topic of what they were spatting about. It could just be a conversation, getting to know each other, and they can do that without recording, or they can record it. It could also be kind of like what we're doing here with a group where they're having a conversation for 20 minutes or so, and then they open it up, and other people can kind of help diagnose what if there is disagreement, where is the source of disagreement, to kind of course you'd want it to be people who that weren't rushing to one side and something like that. It would be people who could play the role of memetic mediators, I guess.
Yeah.
Or performative agnostics or something like that.
Yeah, something that's coming up for me. I know I mentioned it before. I'm definitely not allergic to conflict, and I know that the conflict is kind of inherent in the selection of the people here. If we're kind of trying to bridge ideological or tribal gaps, but I do think to kind of keep with this metaphor of the campfire, the reason that it one of the components that seems to be very rich there is that there's kind of a warmth, right? And it's like providing a source of of life for everybody involved. So there's kind of like an inherent positive frame that needs to be included in as well. And that being said, this doesn't have, I don't want to like systematize it so much, but I think if we can think about how we're framing these conversations, depending on who's going to be in the conversations, it'll be very important. And sometimes I think that'll mean that we have to find some topic that there's some agreement already on, and right. Maybe seeing slightly differences. And then some tribes are very comfortable with conflict and they want to brawl it out, and they're fine. And afterwards they can hug and not break any bridges or anything like that. But there has to be some sort of conviviality or pro-social orientation, I think, if we're gonna be setting these dialogues up.
So what feels really alive right now is something that both of you said. I really like what you said, Jason, that it doesn't have to be about disagreements. It could just be about like relating in front of the campfire.
Yeah.
And like at the edge of my thinking with all the memetic tribal culture war stuff, like all the propositions are just like red herrings for just sort of like, like trigger beefs that they're having, or emotional, like, they get triggered in a certain way. And so, and then going what you just said, Jared, it's like finding the right angle or the right topic, the right frame that like speaks to both of their daemons, and then setting up a situation so they gather around the digital campfire so they can have what you just described, Jason.
Yeah. Well, the question is, how much do we set up the frame and how much do they set up the frame, right? Because if it's something like LetterWiki where, one person, they're both signed up to LetterWiki and they invite the other one to start a letter, like they're the ones that are really setting the frame. And so I'm wondering how, like how do you balance the individuals involved kind of setting the frame versus, ensuring that you have some kind of, conviviality and constructiveness to the conversation.
Yeah, it feels, my intuition is that, since there's going to be such a diversity in the dynamics of who's going to be attending, it feels like there needs to be it would be very beneficial to have some sort of process to go through. And as I'm thinking it through, it might be, answer these 3 questions as you're coming into it. Like, what are your goals for this conversation? What are you afraid of being triggered by, or something like that, kind of airing our own ideological biases and making it transparent so that everybody's kind of aware of what the agenda is, and something like, I think we'd have to like actually sit down and kind of think through, and we could probably use some of the previous discussions and the letter wikis and stuff like that to kind of boil down like these essential points of memetic mediation and make sure each of them is kind of being is visible for everybody that's involved or something like that. But I'd like it for it to be, to your point, Jason, something that they arrive at, and it's kind of meaning that every time it's going to be a completely different frame that they're setting. But right. The people in the conversation are the ones that are doing it.
So let's open up to the group in a moment, but let's maybe do one. I'll have a final thought, and maybe we can do one round of final thoughts, and then we'll open it up. And Key just asked, can someone define memetic mediation for me, please? Let's pause that for a moment, because this is sort of, let's pause that for a moment, because I kind of want to geek out about this right now and not get to the 101 territory. So the final thought here is, for me, before we open up to the group, is like as a kind of a marketing angle. And because I've done hundreds of events in person, and then it's like you just kind of like want to market a certain way, and I've done like 35 events here at the Stoa already, and how the event is marketed, or how it's framed, how it's like coined, it attracts a certain people, has like a bias to attract, and the filter is kind of for the right people in a way if you market it correctly. And leaning into kind of my sensitivities on the culture war and being able to sort of method act all these different reality tunnels, if you can do that well enough, then you can kind of find the angle potentially of what speaks to them, and they find the angle of what speaks to the other person, and then maybe find the intersection between the two. And then that's what you present to them. Like, hey, would you like to come to the Stoa for this? Yeah. So my side, I could be wrong here. I do like the idea that we have to let it emerge, but especially if people don't want to even talk to each other, it's like almost like some of the front end work was on up to us to figure out how to seduce them in a way.
Yeah. So it seems like you could have both. You could have, something that's kind of, like somebody notices a couple people not having constructive dialogue, but perhaps they could, and they, then they workshop with a few other people, marketing, kind of a framing of the conversation, and they present it to the folks, and then they do it or not. And then people who spontaneously say like, hey, I've had some like not so great interactions with you, say on Twitter. Let's have a conversation, let's record it, and let's just try and go into this with good faith. And perhaps we can ask somebody else, a third party, to sit in there and be the quote unquote mediator. Not that the mediator will say much, but will be somebody that both parties can trust to, not to tip the scales in one direction or another.
Yeah, it sounds like we've thrown a lot out. I'm kind of, yeah, I'm curious at what
Yeah, curious
what
to see
some
how
of the
that
people
get
are
other
thinking.
people.
Okay.
But yeah.
So yeah, just I'm going to set the frame here that this is admittedly a high level discussion, and if you have no idea what the fuck memetic mediation is, Jason did a nice little brief intro. So if you came late, then unfortunately you missed that. You can go to that cultural white paper and just search memetic mediation to get, maybe just read that section of it. But this is pretty high level, and we're going to keep it high level, or at least I have a desire to keep it high level. And so that being said, anything, and I trust everyone's discernment in the room. So just kind of unmute yourself. Let's see if everyone has that option. We all have that option. So just unmute yourself and just kind of share what came alive for you, or what you want to add to the conversation.
Yeah, hi. Sorry, I'll just quickly interrupt. Hey, Jason. Hey, Peter. Hey, everybody. I never talked to Jared directly, so hello, Jared. One thing that came up to me when Jason was talking is, you described, two people that had a disagreement on Twitter. They then get into this space, and then they have a third mediator, right? Mm-hmm. But then earlier we also talked about, okay, what if we have other people in the space listening in, and then after a 20-minute or 30-minute, who knows how long, back and forth, these people can then, like now, unmute themselves and then put in their inputs, because then you just have so much, a wealth of information to draw from, and so many different angles to perhaps mediate between the two. Mm-hmm. that could be super beneficial, instead of just a third, like just three people. So what do you think of that?
I think it might vary depending on the the individual interaction. So I mean, one thing I'd be concerned about with a big group is that it becomes a pile on one side, right? And so it would have to be in the group people who could somewhat play the role of performative agnostic, meaning that they can kind of put aside their views a little bit and just try to help clarify the conversation, like where are people misunderstanding each other, like maybe when you said this, you reacted this way, they, like maybe you were misinterpreting them, and then could you maybe interpret it this way, and then the other person says, is that fair to you? And so to kind of just help kind of mediate. And the nice thing about just one or two mediators is that you can beforehand, you can get the buy-in of both participants saying, hey, these two people, do they, do you trust these two people enough to mediate this conversation? But I think it will depend, personally on this situation. And I think sometimes having 8 people like now, extra people, makes sense, and sometimes maybe less, or sometimes none. If the two people think that they can handle themselves, and they don't need a third mediator, they can also opt for that as well.
What's coming to mind there is too, it's like, let's say if there's 2 matches, or 2 people that we think would be good to talk to each other, but then there's sort of resistance that they have to talk to one another. And it's like, it's almost like when I'm viewing the Stoa space is like being an artist of experience. So each session is kind of different. And it could be like, you and I, Jason, did empathy circles, for example, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe, we do an empathy circle for one session. Maybe it's something as simple as just sharing your emotional reality in front of someone you don't really like, or you don't like their ideas. Yeah. And what came to mind was when Jack Murphy came on a couple of days ago. Some sessions I open up with like sharing my emotional reality, some I don't. But I felt like, what? He has a lot of his liminal kind of alpha males in the audience, and he's like a alpha male. So I'm like, I'm going to share my emotional reality. I'm going to say that I'm nervous right now, which I was. Mm-hmm. And then that, I think, invited him to say that he was nervous because he shared it when he went up, because he thought like, okay, I'm not a philosopher. Like, what am I doing here? Mm-hmm. And I felt him more, and I think the people felt him more. Mm-hmm. So imagine if it's like Richard and Jack just kind of share their emotions or some shit like that, right? And so they build that that bond beyond the propositions.
Mm.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna bring up, is the whole point of memetic mediation, the way I see it, is not so much to resolve things at the memetic level, but to resolve things at a deeper embodied level, like a felt, like the felt bond with another person, that when you get to that place, the propositions sort of lose their hold and their strength on you, and it's not really about that anymore. It's like, well, these are just tools that we're using to try and figure things out together. So the vulnerability, fostering vulnerability, that aspect of mediation, I think is really important. And I think about this a lot in terms of family and close friends in my local community, like physical local community, and people I already have some sort of a bond with. And, you know, I've just been mindful of settling into that bond when I go to have a discussion of, you know, about which, you know, there are propositions where we disagree about things. It's like, well, let's get on the same page at a deeper level, and then see where we're at. And that seems to make a huge difference, at least for me, when I'm looking at someone else's worldview through that felt sense of shared
relationality.
Belonging with this person.
Yeah, there's the feeling into the evoked emotional responses and displaying it verbally is like a, you know, it's a very quick way to move out of the ideology and back into the body, and then seeing that it's happening across the board. It's creating some sort of connection or agreement that, hey, we're both bodies, you know, kind of, we're both humans. And so, yeah, the embodied component is really big. Yeah, it's interesting, you know, on one end of the spectrum, I think we had Peter, we had a conversation a while ago with some of the Letter Wiki folks, and we were talking about what a memetic mediator would look like in that text form too. And there's like a couple quick things that kind of came up of, you know, one of them being like the memetic mediator requesting a definition because they noticed that we're playing a semantics game, or you know, in this case, we're saying, hey, let's do a state check and talk about our emotional place right now. Other times it could be, you know, the mediator, especially in these conversations, I think a lot of their value is to kind of say, hey, I'm seeing that I agree with both of you, but in different ways. So it's like the fact that they could see that it's possible to agree on both sides, even though they see themselves as diametrically opposed. It's almost like there's a very large tool that can be wielded by the memetic mediators, and if we were to make this, if the mediators were, if there's a lot of them as opposed to just a few key people, it might be good to kind of put together a toolkit as well. You know, like here are some of the go-to things. Like, you know, if things are going off the rails, here's a few things in the playbook to kind of create some, you know, break the tension or the conflict or something like that too. Yeah, I don't know. It's just a random thought that would kind of come up. Peter, do you see? So on one end of the spectrum, we're talking about kind of an open space where many people can gather, but like how often do you think there would be like a very common, you know, maybe it's us three that would be kind of setting the frame for this, and maybe even interacting in the conversations, or are we the open source route seems to be a bigger thing, but, you know, it's also then something like a toolkit, or, you know, creating some more method and things like that would be seem like it'd be in hand at least, or needed.
What I was thinking was just sort of like I guess tease out the vision or the impulse of this kind of event is, I like the idea of the three of us riffing for 5 to 15 minutes and then open up to the group to talk about what exactly memetic mediation is for probably this session, or what it could be in this liminal war, and then who would need to have, you know, to be mediated in the culture war. And then I kind of imagine like different, maybe whoever's inspired to go about it can just do like a project, you know, like, okay, yeah, like I could probably do mash those two together, and then, you know, whatever emerges from this. And I think if we record these and then broadcast some of them, if people don't veto it, then I imagine that kind of inspiration could just spread. So I was definitely thinking the more open source realm. And I also add I like the idea of a toolkit, and it also could be just sort of like certain moves, conversational moves someone could do to be a good mediator. And what's coming alive right now, I was just talking to Daniel Kazanjian, who does the metagame mastermind here at the Stoa, and you know that kind of that postmodern skill set where you hear a word, right, like a verbal dispute. If you hear a word that triggers someone, and just kind of pause and then just allow the person to describe the felt sense reality of that word. Like, how do they feel when they say it? Mm-hmm. You know, because like if you take out any word, like I was talking about how tomorrow died for me recently. If you take out the concept of tomorrow has a certain felt sense reality behind it. And like, forget about the propositional accuracy about what that word really means, but let's kind of like flesh out what do you feel like when racism comes up, right? Or some other kind of hot term, and just talk about it and let's see if we can build a relationship with those emotional realities.
I think one thing that is the first or second thing to decide is that what is the star of the show? So is this role model, is the mediator going to be visible? And is that the star? Or is the mediator going to be invisible? And is that the star? Or is the ultimate culmination of accord and agreement, is that the star? And I'm thinking, I like the idea of warmth, and so there has to be something. There has to be either a visible or invisible, structure somewhere, right? That's to make. You don't want the all the videos to be just random videos. You want them to be maybe proving a point, or if it's emergent, there's who's going to want to watch 1 through 10 videos that are all completely different. That's my thought.
I'm curious if others in this group who haven't talked yet have any ideas.
I'll speak to about it from a work approach. So in terms of a conflict example, you could throw me and Jordan on the table. I haven't been gentle by any means. At the same time, if your goal is the end product of developing a work, then that needs to be what people are focused on. By and large, I don't fucking care what your opinion is as long as it's informed. If it's informed, it could be different than mine. There's no requirement for any kind of concordance. But if people are going to bring bullshit to the table and distractions, that's a whole different deal. So one of the most effective work relationships I ever had was with this dude named Simon. We always saw things 90 to 180 degrees different, but we continuously pushed things back and forth. And by the time we were done, we had a very optimal solution to whatever problem it was we were addressing at the time. And people need to set the ego stuff aside and start looking at what the big picture goal is, and it's not attached to you, it's not attached to your outcome. It's like we're trying to do something bigger here. I think some of the community building needs to be around engaging in mutual projects together where there is some kind of difficulty. Because I mean, you need some commonality of shared experience in order to build a sense of community. And if that experience is arduous, then the depth of camaraderie is definitely higher.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, of course, the challenge is, if this is mainly from online space, it's hard to just get kind of, I agree that having a larger goal in terms of, well, why do we want to mediate with each other besides just everyone, feeling nice about it? Well, because you know, there's a lot going on in the world right now, and, you know, we need real collaboration to, you know, improve our response, you know, our resilience and our collective intelligence, and be able to actually, you know, make us, you know, make the world a better place.
I think a big chunk of that is just bringing people more into adult mode instead of the coddling and, is everybody okay? It's like, well, we're adults. We've got shit to get done here. If you've got something that needs that has some kind of contention, take it offline. But in the meantime, there needs to be some kind of a focus, even if it's just project based. But I think a big part of it is encouraging people to develop the kind of skills that keep them in adult state. So less on the body and the emotions, but more, I mean, there's always a balance between the getting caught up with your head up your ass with hyper-rationalism and not having any kind of grounded reality to, you know, emotional realism. But at the same time, the emotional stuff is almost always just a trap. It's an easy way for people to throw their little hook in, divert the course of the conversation towards whatever ends they're seeking for their own gratification, as opposed to staying on focus to what the actual task is and doing the planning, doing the exercises that need to get done to see that to fruition. And I probably sound kind of technical because my background is software and systems architecture, and I'm heavily fit towards the engineering side of things, not emotive. But in terms of having to get shit done in big complex situations, that's how it works. Those are the tool sets you need to engage in order to reach those goals.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think we're at least in my mind, there's kind of an implied project in just the phrasing memetic mediation, and that is simply that decentralized kind of collective approach to, you know, building a new ways of operating and collaborating is not happening right now. And so the memetic mediation, as opposed to being it's predominantly focused on kind of the in-between space, the in-between projects, right? So it's like the more mediation that's happening, the easier it is for ideas and memes to cross-propagate across different groups. And then, you know, next time a software product is created, it might take into consideration different lenses and ideas, because they were talking to people that they weren't talking to previously. And another thing I'd like to kind of throw out there as well is that I think conflict is the predominant frame that we're talking about here. But I think that we can also talk about just simply disconnection. I think a lot of these campfires should be getting people together that have no idea that they exist. Right. And maybe they don't even disagree, but they need to be talking to each other, right? So it's like, right. This is this cross propagation, the encouraging the permeability of the membranes of each of our groups is kind of the primary big picture focus. But, you know, Robert and Jason, both you guys are mentioning that it seems like there needs to be some more micro takeaways as well, even if it's in one conversation or a smaller midterm project or something like that too. I like the idea. Nothing is, it's hard to think of what kind of projects might be readily available to graft onto that.
Yeah, so I think I have something coming up, and what Jason said didn't resonate with me, and I'll kind of flesh out why, and then kind of present my working theory on this. I do agree. I like the adult metaphor, that adults can get in the room together and figure out the superordinate goal that unites them there, and then they kind of through reason figure out what the fuck to do, right? But when you're in a situation in Culture War 2.0, when there are all these memetic tribes that understand reality differently, how do you get them to have a superordinate goal by just allowing them to talk to each other? They don't talk to each other. And so I think the beats or the movements, and I could be mistaken about this, but it's step one, build the capacity for good faith, right? Build the capacity to have good faith with someone. And I would argue that's emotional capacity, actually kind of have a heart-to-heart connection with someone, or kind of feel them, Then step two, then reason together, right? Like get to the brass tacks of the proposition and what is true and whatnot.
I think
Well, hold on. And my sense is that is sort of one of the essence of the digital campfires, to get that kind of heart to heart, like what Jason said earlier. And kind of like the trickster in me is like each session, and this is to answer Robert's question, each sort of memetic project that could emerge from these spitballing sessions could have its own superordinate goal that speaks to the two people who should be speaking with each other. So maybe it's an empathy to circles, maybe it's an anti-debate, maybe it's just a good old debate, maybe it's just like a sharing circle. So that's what came up.
If I can respond there. Over my life experience, I think it's less important to try to reach everybody as opposed to reach the people who are actually thinking. And there are not many of them. They're hard to find, but if we can get them working together, then we've got something to work with. Trying to bootstrap everybody up is a long and tedious and most of the time a fruitless process. You need to build trust relationships on two vectors. I need to trust your capacity and your intentions. And the only way I'm going to see that is through iterations of experience of working together, I think.
Speaking of trust, I agree with that line of thinking. And I should say that I also appreciate the intention of transparency in open source projects, creating a toolkit, and having a beneficial process to go through for like questions that can be answered for people to have these memetic mediations. I'd like to point out that I enjoy the STOA for the definitely experimental process that it can be, and I am completely an intro, and I keep saying that every time I do come onto the space, because I really am learning from scratch these kinds of philosophical topics. So I say that, and I started with trust because I to find this particular session, I went to the stoa.com, which I go on there like every time to check out the events. And I'm speaking in this kind of tone because, yeah, this is the kind of like personality that I go into the stoa with sometimes. So I clicked on stoa.com and I saw that this event was going to be at 1 p.m. But I was on at 1:30. And I was like, oh, wow, it's probably already done. But I was like, hey, there's still a link here. So I clicked on it and it said 3:30 on the Google Docs. I'm like, damn, guys, I can still join. So I joined. And I'm really glad that I did because I'm learning a lot and I want to participate and I love being able to participate in these kinds of things because I am learning from different types of people. I love like project-based focuses, focus. I like a project-based focus because it does lead towards problem-solving methods that are framed in ways that lead to informed discussions. And that balance of emotional, the emotions and the logic and the reason is really, really needed in all of us, that embodied way of thinking and that that highly philosophical, like logical proposition statements, ideas are both important in their own ways. So to be able to put those things together and have a space to do so, thank you, Peter. And thank you to the people who are coming in here. So I just needed to say those things.
So I have a question. So like Jason said, right, like people who can get things done, they are the ones that matter. And how Peter and the others are kind of trying to frame. They're asking like, you know, what about the others who want to come in and learn, who want to kind of help in kind of putting things together, want to be a part? So if we had to mediate between these two different viewpoints, the only thing that again keeps coming up for me is the fact that you need a common shared project on which we can then distribute the processing, right? So if you distribute processing, right, everybody becomes a node, everybody is allowed to go into their rabbit hole, bring back what they can bring, then we sit together and in a given particular context, we examine that together, right? And those that need to take lead, those that need to mediate. So each one kind of moves onto the spectrum of their personality and they kind of like work on that project together from there we can actually see what works, what does not work, you know, what are the frameworks we're supposed to employ, these kind of things. Because what we do at what I do at my work, right, we're building a platform where we are trying to see how we can allow people to kind of move out and distribute their cognitive capacity. So rather than me trying to do something on my own, how can I get, for example, let me just use an example because it's easier, right? Let's say I need to study about a subject, cognitive psychology, right? I can read one book at a time. Now, if I called Jared, I called Jason, I called Peter and I said, hey man, this is what I want to learn about. Are you guys also interested? Oh, you guys look interested, just so come along. So we take the subject, each of us read 5 different books on the subject. So we have distributed that. Then we come back, like how Jason said, we trust each other for our capacity, all of that stuff. And then we go and we kind of like distill what we've learned. Then we compile all these from the 5 different vantage points, 5 different nodes, we compile all of that information. And from there, we start kind of like pulling in and pulling out. So when that what needs to stay and what needs to go conversation starts, that's when the actual memetic mediation kind of like comes in. Because I personally believe that coming from, yes, culture war, yes, but that's moved now, right? So rather than trying to bring people from extremes together, we should come to the middle and see who are the people on either side who are closer to the middle and what are the strategies that we can do to engage them. And once we kind of build from that core place where we can see, okay, you know, these people will invest time and energy into this, how from there then can we like start scaling outwards and pull the, you know, people at the extremities to like kind of come in. So that would be the strategy I would employ. Yeah.
If I can speak to the campfire for a minute. When this COVID stuff is done, I've got a nice spot up here just outside of Toronto. We can maybe do a meeting outside of the city. I think so a lot of the stuff that we're dealing with in terms of subject matter and information within it, it's all exceedingly complex. But I think in large part, there's a couple of things that are missing off the table in this conversation. I think there are a lot of, let's say, learning methodologies within information technology that are easily adaptable to the cognitive stuff. And I think one of the things that's kind of missing in the big picture of the discussion is some kind of grounding in, you know, formalized mystery traditions. I'd look around the discussion. I don't see a whole lot of depth of people who have actually engaged that pathway, and I don't see a lot of people talking about it. I mean, from a personal perspective, I've been involved in Freemasonry since 2002. And as an institutional model, both the ritual model in terms of engaging or inculcating lessons to the individual, I think is very effective. The use of the object lesson. And I think the institutional model where you take someone, you basically start them at the outside gate and you bring them in and put them through all these seats or chairs that are required to run an organization effectively. And as you're bringing them through, you're basically progressing them as a person and also training them to be capable of actually running the organization. So I think there's some value in that model that I haven't really seen brought to the table in any kind of depth yet.
Yeah, so I just had a couple thoughts. I know these kind of in-between space conversations and kind of speculation and very, you know, to Peter's point, we kind of started with this high-level frame and not quite in the nitty-gritty yet. And then, you know, Jason, when you showed us your campfire, I kind of felt why I was feeling kind of weird about this, like, what are we making? What are we doing? What project? What are the deliverables from this? And I think that was quickly, or it came to me very quickly when I saw that campfire. And that's a sense like when last time I was at a campfire, there's no agenda. It was just, let's enjoy each other's presence and have conversations and relate and build connections after we're done working for the day. You know, we've been goal oriented and collaborating on a daily basis. And this is a time for us to kind of reflect, get some distance, and bring in some other perspectives. So maybe that might be why I was having some kind of resistance to the extremely kind of hyper-focused, goal-oriented space. And you know, this also speaks to other work environments. I know Apple's kind of renowned for building their offices to in a way that promotes collisions from very different perspectives. You know, they put the bathrooms all on one side so that all these people have to be, that are different departments, are kind of running into each other and having these chance conversations with no agenda. But those types of environments are usually when the most kind of rich insight and unique processes emerge. And that's because it's in this unordered space. And I largely, while I think they have to be intimately connected, memetic mediation feels like it's a lot more about the space in between the projects and the goals.
Right.
And yeah, so yeah, and that's just, yeah, I guess, but you know, I'm a goal-oriented guy, and I want to be heads down doing stuff on projects every day. But sometimes I just want to shoot the shit out of the campfire and play some guitar or something.
On that note,
Sinophotal wave, yeah.
On that note, Jason, that's or Jared, I should say. I like that, because the hyper goal thing doesn't resonate with me when I think of this project of memetic mediation. And if I were to kind of put myself in that mindset, almost like a sense of arrogance emerges that, oh, I know what the superordinate goal is. And just like that campfire thing that you mentioned, Jared, and then that I keep returning what you said earlier, Jason, just sort of like, just crack open a beer with someone at the campfire. And I think Gavin McGinnis, he said, he was talking about how Vice broke up, and his heuristic was that, like, yeah, you know, when you stop grabbing beer with your co-founder, you know, shit's going to hit the fan. And so like the thought emerges, like, who do we want to have a kind of encourage to have a beer with each other around this kind of memetic campfire?
Yeah, I have to say I'm kind of leaning both in what Peter and Jared are saying, is that I think the superordinate goal comes later. I think for me, the main issue, and I don't think it's that some people are thinking and some people are run by their emotions. I disagree with that diagnosis. I think that a lot of people have the capacity to think, but because of their ideologies, which is, you know, tied to their identity and emotions, is causing them not to talk to each other when they could actually have, you know, very constructive, more logical, propositional conversations. But because they have some kind of allergy, to an ideological allergy, that they never even get in the room with each other. And so I just don't see that the world in the way that you do, Jason.
Fair enough. Not many people do.
I see where you're coming from, but I think this idea of putting aside your emotions, I think you can't do that because the emotions are still in the background and they're going to come back and bite. Like the idea that before you can engage in a goal or in a logical propositional conversation, you just need to get comfortable with each other, a basic bonding process, as we talked about before. And I relate this to like Kagan stages as an analogy, where, you know, stage 3 is the more sub-ideological relational stage. And I think you need a good foundation there before you start getting into the more like, let's develop coherent ideology together, or let's develop, you know, something else, you know, a set of values together. And that might involve being vulnerable and, you know, allowing yourself to be emotional in front of each other, and but in a safe environment where it's not going to blow up and, you know, cause even further division.
Well, and to kind of add a little bit there too, there's no conversations that don't have emotions involved, right? Like, you know, if we just look at psychological research, we find that rationalization is the predominant, you know, the rational mind is rationalizing our emotional reactions in many ways. And so this memetic mediation, what we're doing, especially when we're talking about getting in touch with the felt sense, this is showing us our own boundaries and trying to, you know, say, okay, well, this is normally something I can't talk about because it's just too ridiculous to me, or too or it's absurd, or it's violent, or it's whatever it is. But, you know, the more we kind of feel into those spaces and relate with each other, there's a dissolving that happens, and it actually allows our thinking to be more broad and inclusive, as opposed to stuck into a very our kind of conditioned reality of this is what's right, this is what's wrong, and stuff like that. So yeah, just to kind of add some more meat on the bones of Jason's emotional comments.
When you have those hooks into the the limbic system, the default mode network, or anything that kicks off the limbic system is going to kick off the default mode network and kind of drop down the working ceiling of what you're actually capable of. Mm-hmm. So the emotional states, I kind of look at them as like indicator lights on a car. If they're telling you something, you've missed something in the situational awareness up to that point. They're kind of like the last resort indicators. The process is we're trying to figure out how not to let those indicator lights interfere with us actually operating the machine. So yeah, it takes a whole hell of a lot of work. Constipation is no healthier than diarrhea in terms of a processing system. So we can't be just eating our shit and swallowing it down and not coming to terms with any kind of the realistic consequences about emotive stress or anything else like that. But at the same time, watching people, they play that game pretty hard. Like a lot of people dwell and revel in their misery to a large degree. You can see that where it's something that has upset them, they just glom onto it and attach to it and won't let that thing go. Mm-hmm. Whereas if they can just soften the grip a little bit, step back, then it's a little easier to walk through and process that kind of stuff.
I want to say so there's two different goals. There's a goal for a resolution of an ideological question, but I don't think that we care what the answers are.
Exactly. We'll find out.
The goal is to show something, I like the words now, warmth and space. And I agree that it's emergent in some sense. It's a chat by the campfire. It doesn't have a direction, but it also does have a goal in another sense. And that goal isn't an intellectual correctness, or nothing's going to be produced. It's it's something about connecting, and it's the space has to have some sort of role model, though, and I don't know how to do that, but something is pedagogic, right? Something, and it could all just be structured and not a third person being a mediator. But something, there has to be that point, but that point is different from like, what is the correct answer? So we're not, I mean, in my view, we're not looking for the correct answer. We're looking for what I said.
So I'm just going to jump in. The time. I want to invite anyone who hasn't spoken, if they feel called to speak. If not, then me, Jason, and Jared will just kind of do our closing thoughts, and we'll close up today. So I'll just give a moment for anyone who wants to speak who hasn't spoken yet. And I'm sort of looking at you, James, my meta modern friend.
You want me to say something, Peter?
I'm curious if you have any thoughts. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting just seeing everybody's perspectives. I am more of a cultural theorist, I guess you might say. So even though I'm by far not an academic, I like to understand the sort of socio-historical analysis behind this, and then see if I can't deconstruct it and then see what it takes to reconstruct it. If that makes sense. So, it just, what are you, if you're going to, in other words, it's almost like you have to have a bunch of study, and then you got to kind of draw out what is that thing that needs to be mediated. And it's going to depend on very complex individual and situational analysis. So, you know, there's a whole lot of talk here that is, you know, just by, you know, the 8 of us or however many are talking, that's going to take a lot longer than an hour to kind of figure out. But I mean, that's just kind of where I'm at. You know, I as you know, Peter, I kind of think of it in terms of, you know, cultural eras and generations. And, you know, I've been reading a lot of literature on the academic history of the generation gap, for instance, and figuring out how to kind of mememically mediate that over the course of history, which is that's just what I like to do. But of course, nobody probably cares about that specific instance. But you know, that's just what I'm thinking. So
Cool. Thanks,
I'm
man.
done speaking.
So how about we'll close up maybe just 1 minute each, guys, like Jared and Jason. Let's just do our 1 minute closing thoughts, and then we'll end it today.
Mm-hmm. I think it's hard to anticipate what the problems are going to be that we're going to need to be able to collaborate on in an intelligent way and make sense with each other. And so for me, memetic mediation is kind of setting the conditions for that to happen when the need to collaborate will arise. You know, I think this COVID situation maybe is a good example where, you know, if you look at the information ecology, you know, different groups knew about the virus and the potential danger of the virus, you know, very early, and groups that don't normally talk to each other, right? And they're kind of medically sealed off from each other. And if they could have been communicating much earlier, you know, that might have had a greater impact on the overall preparation of the culture, because, you know, a lot of these folks, like on Twitter, do have a lot of influence, right? And so for me, it's not about, you know, finding the problem that you want to solve right away. It's getting people comfortable with each other and at least respectful of each other's views, such that they're not going to straw man each other and all of that, such that when problems do arise, they can very quickly connect and, you know, work together to get something accomplished. So that's my thinking. I'll leave it there.
Right. I can go next, and then Jared, maybe you can close. Yeah, lots of things. I thought that was a lot of great metaphors and thoughts came up here, and a lot of seeds were definitely planted. So I'm appreciative of this sort of mediation campfire. I like that. And this is last minute. We had some juicy conversation. So imagine if we had like a week advance of posting this, what could have happened? And then I wanted to flag something that I think it was Jason and Peter said, and the way I interpret it, I felt that there was a conveyance of what I felt I was misunderstood, or something that like there was projected a certain kind of narrative or framework on me that I didn't agree with, and that could be totally my misreading of it. But I noticed when I had that, I got triggered. I got emotionally triggered. Right. I just wanted to let's fight. Let's fucking debate. Right. I just wanted to get in that mode. And so let's just assume that is just all my shit, my end, or let's just, you know, another reality. Let's assume that I was misinterpreted. Right. I think for me personally, at my edge, and I think this is a good skill set to have, is be very, very comfortable with being misinterpreted.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny that you say that, the being misinterpreted, because I talk to my wife a lot about how I'm very frustrated with language, because I don't think there's any way that I can express what I'm actually feeling. And when I hear myself say it, I'm like, oh, that doesn't sound like it at all. I don't know. That's not it. And so it's definitely a struggle. Yeah, my main thought here right now is actually, I hate to say it, but I'm kind of thinking that memetic mediation might have some colloquial assumptions baked into it, especially the mediation point, in the sense that it seems to be focused on the resolution of conflict. And the simple rebranding that comes to mind right now is like, what would it? I think if we called it a memetic campfire, like that just changes the frame completely, right? Because we kind of speaking to the fact that this campfire metaphor has so much less resolution-oriented goals. It's just let's be together and let's have some interpersonal contact. So yeah, I don't know, just some thoughts. But that being said, the memetic mediation itself, I still think is kind of like the underlying long-term goal or orientation at the same time. But it's a long, memetic mediation is a long game. We're not changing minds in single conversations. It's a slow process of relating. So yeah, I don't know, just a few of my thoughts.
I like that. I like that. Okay, so if anyone wants to veto this recording, just message me in the chat box now or find me elsewhere. I'll probably post this maybe later today or tomorrow. And if you veto it, I will delete it. If not, it'll probably go up on YouTube. Other than that, I'm just going to debrief with Jason and Jared, hopefully, and then we'll see what we're going to do next. So thanks, everyone, for coming on.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much, guys.